They laughed at her for
Look at
6 years.
that. Oh boy, what a
4 men at a
sight.
fence line in
Hey,
Kansas.
can't believe it.
1 woman in a creek. April of 1976. She was 67 years old. She was a widow. She was carrying a measuring rope in one hand and a notebook in the other. And she was about to do something that the entire county would call foolish for the next 6 summers. She was going to build a wall of creek stone, to hold water, in a county that had never run out of water in living memory. They drew cartoons of her
There,
at the
fixed
co-op.
him good.
They pinned them to the
That's
bulletin
him, all
board.
right.
They called it
Did you
Whitfield
hear what he
Waterworks,
said?
holding
No
back the
way.
heavens.
And that widow's
The
property,
loudest
just
of the
look
men,
at it.
a neighbor
She lets
named
it fall
Daryl
apart just
Purcell,
like everything
swore
else.
he would send his grandkids to swim in her puddle.
Please, I beg you, don't turn
6 years
me away.
later, that same man stood
got
at her
nowhere
kitchen
else to
door
go.
with his hat in his hands.
Let me prove
He was
myself,
begging for water,
please.
and the woman they had laughed at, 67 years old, 420 acres, no husband, no son at home, no help in the world except an old hired hand named Wendell, opened the door and poured him a cup of coffee and said the thing that every woman in
Thank
Calhoun County would eventually learn by heart.
Take your time.
But to understand what she said, you have to understand what she had been carrying. You have to go back to a Tuesday afternoon in 1943. You have to go back to a tractor on a slope. You have to go back to the day her father, the day he buried his son, looked
Listen to
across the
me,
kitchen
daughter.
table at his daughter
The path
and
you've
said 5
chosen
words
is
that would change her
dangerous.
life.
There
Her
is
name
no
was
turning
Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone called her Nora, and this is her story. The wheat was knee-high in late April. That's the first thing you need to see. Not the woman, not the men, the wheat. Knee-high, green, soft in the wind that came down off the Flint Hills and crossed Calhoun County, Kansas, the way it had crossed it for 10,000 years before anyone showed up with a plow. The wheat didn't care who watched it. The wheat just grew. But somebody was watching. 4 men at the fence line, 1 woman in the creek. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone called her Nora. She was 67 years old. She was standing ankle-deep in Kettle Creek with the cold water sliding around her rubber boots, and she had a knotted rope in her left hand and a small leather notebook in her shirt pocket, and she was doing math. The men at the fence were not doing math. The men at the fence were laughing. Daryl Purcell was the loudest. He was 60 years old that spring, broad across the chest, red in the face from the wind, and from the kind of pleasure a certain kind of man takes in being right out loud in front of other men. His John Deere cap was pushed back. His left boot was up on the bottom rail of the fence. His right hand was pointing at the creek. "A dam?" he said. "Eleanor Whitfield's going to build herself a dam." The other 3 men laughed. Hollis Briggs from the co-op laughed because he laughed at whatever Daryl laughed at. Roland Mossman laughed because his 400 acres ran south, and he was a serious man and didn't like serious things, and was grateful for permission to be silly. The 4th one was a young hand named Gale who worked for Roland and hadn't yet earned an opinion of his own. They were all looking at the same thing. A woman in a creek, a widow in a creek. A widow in a creek with a rope. "You're going to dam up a creek?" Daryl called out across the wheat. "That's run full every spring since before your daddy was born." Nora wrote a number in her notebook. "You're going to spend your summer," Daryl said, "stacking rocks. So you can hold water. You're going to get anyway." She moved 6 feet upstream. She measured again. "She's going to flood her own pasture," Roland Mossman said. "She's going to flood her own mind," Daryl said, "is what she's going to do." And all 4 of them laughed, and Nora Whitfield heard every word of it, and kept measuring. That's the picture. Hold it in your head. The wheat in the wind, the woman in the water, the men on the fence. Because that picture is going to do work. That picture is going to live for 6 years before anybody understands what it meant. 6 years. 6 years of laughter at the co-op. 6 years of cartoons on the bulletin board. 6 years of a woman walking into a feed store while men stopped talking just long enough to grin. 6 years. And then the sky changed. We're in April 1976. And Nora Whitfield is walking back across her field in wet boots with a small notebook in her shirt pocket and a number written in it that nobody else in the county would understand. She doesn't look back at the fence. She doesn't need to. She can hear them. She just walks. Her farmhouse sat on a rise 3/4 of a mile from the creek. White clapboard, tin roof patched in two places. A wraparound porch her husband had rebuilt the summer before he died. Henry Whitfield had been a careful man with a hammer. The porch was still square. The board still met clean. 5 years after his heart had stopped in the south field, his porch still held. She climbed the steps. She didn't take off her boots. She walked through the front room and into the kitchen and set the notebook on the table next to a coffee cup that was already cold. Then she stood there, just stood there, in her wet boots, looking at the notebook. 67 years old. And she said it out loud, to nobody, the way people who live alone start to say things out loud when the house is too quiet. He's wrong. She wasn't talking about Daryl. She was talking about her son, because there was a letter on the table next to the notebook. The letter had come 3 days before. The letter had her son Lawrence's handwriting on the envelope, slanted to the right the way Henry's had slanted, and the letter inside was 4 pages long. And the letter said, in language that was careful and gentle and felt like a knife, "Mother, you are 67 years old. You don't have to prove anything anymore. Mr. Purcell has offered fair money. I think it's time." Larry had moved to Wichita in 1968. He had not been back since. He had not been back when his father died. That was the thing she couldn't say to anybody, not even to Wendell, not even to herself most days. Larry had not come back for the funeral. He had sent flowers. He had sent a card. He had called the night before and told her he couldn't make the drive because of work. And she had said that's all right, because that's what mothers say. And then she had hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen and not cried. She did not cry. She did not cry then. She did not cry now. She picked up the notebook. She opened it to the page with the number on it. She read the number. The number was small. The number was 4 inches. 4 inches. The water in Kettle Creek at the narrowing below the Big Sycamore on the 23rd of April, 1976, was running 4 inches lower than it had run on the 23rd of April, 1975, and 1 inch lower than it had run on the 23rd of April, 1974, and 5 inches lower than it had run on the 23rd of April, 1965. Nobody else was reading those numbers. Nobody else had those numbers. Nora Whitfield had those numbers because her father had taught her to take them, and her father had taught her to take them because his son had died. Her father was Clarence Briarwood. He had homesteaded these 420 acres in 1901, buying the land at $2.50 an acre from a land agent out of Topeka. He had drilled the first well. He had built the first barn. He had lost the first crop to hail and survived the dry years of the 1910s by storing water in a hand-dug pond behind the machine shed. And he had taught all of this, every bit of it, to his only son. His son was Howard Briarwood. Tall, quick, born in 1907. The boy who was going to inherit the farm. Howard died in 1943. A tractor. A tractor and a slope and a wet spring and a moment of not quite attention. Howard died on a Tuesday afternoon in the North Field. He was 36 years old. He had a wife in town and a baby on the way. The baby was born 4 months later. The baby was a boy. The wife took the baby and moved back to St. Joseph, Missouri, and Clarence Briarwood sat at his kitchen table on the night of the funeral and looked across at his only other child, his daughter Eleanor, who was 34 years old and married to a young man named Henry Whitfield. And Clarence said, "You'll have to learn it." But Clarence had been teaching her since 1925. She had been 16. He had taken her out to the creek one Saturday morning in March and showed her the gauge stake he had driven into the bank below the sycamore in 1903. And he had said, "The creek tells you what the year's going to be. You just have to listen." And she listened. For 18 years she listened, on Saturdays, on Sunday afternoons after church, in the evenings when supper was done. She listened because her father was teaching her, and her father was a quiet man who only taught one person at a time. She thought, for those 18 years, that he was teaching her because she was his daughter, and he loved her. Then Howard died, and she understood. He had been teaching her the whole time. He had been teaching her since 1925 because some part of him, some old farm part that read weather and read land and read the slope of a tractor and a wet spring, had known something, had known enough to teach two children instead of one, just in case. Clarence Briarwood died in 1959. He left Nora the farm, the equipment, the deed, and 47 years of weather notebooks. She kept them going. By April of 1976, she had 73 years of continuous weather records for this specific piece of ground. And what those records told her, when she read them carefully and laid them side by side on the kitchen table under the kerosene lamp, was something nobody else in Calhoun County had yet said out loud. The wet cycles were shortening. The dry years were coming closer together. What used to be one drought decade in 5 was becoming 1 in 3. The creek ran lower every spring than it had the spring before. Not dramatically, not the way a storm comes in. The way a person ages, the way a house settles, quiet, steady, the kind of change you'd miss unless you were looking at 73 years of gauge readings. But she was looking. She had been looking since 1925, and what she saw scared her enough to spend her summer stacking rocks. The kitchen, April 23rd. The notebook on the table, the letter from Larry next to the notebook, the cold coffee, the wet boots. She stood there. She picked up the letter. She read it again. Slowly. The way you reread something you wish would say something different the second time. It didn't. Mother, you are 67 years old. That was true. You don't have to prove anything anymore. That was also true. But it was the wrong sentence. Because she wasn't trying to prove anything. She was trying to keep her father's land alive long enough to hand it to somebody, even if she didn't know yet who that somebody would be. Mr. Purcell has offered fair money. That part she stopped on. Darrell Purcell had been offering to buy her land for 5 years, since the spring after Henry died. He had driven up the lane in 1972 with a casserole dish his wife Vivian had made and a smile he thought was sympathetic. And he had sat at the table in this very kitchen and said, Eleanor, a woman alone shouldn't have to manage 420 acres. And she had thanked him for the casserole and let him say his piece. And then she had walked him to the door and watched him drive away. He had been back twice. Each time the offer was lower. Each time he was a little less careful with his face. Now her own son was writing letters using Darrell Purcell's name like it meant fair. She folded the letter. She didn't tear it. She didn't throw it. She folded it twice and she put it in the drawer with the kitchen twine and the seed packets from last year and the church bulletin from Henry's funeral. She went out to the equipment shed and found Wendell. Wendell Mosley was 62 years old. He had a face like a piece of bark and hands that had not been cleaned since 1957. He had come to work for Clarence Briarwood the summer Howard died. He had stayed. He was still here. 19 years of Saturdays and Sundays and Christmas mornings spent with the Briarwood Whitfield family. And he had never married and never lived more than a quarter mile from his bed in the bunk room behind the barn. He looked up when she came into the shed. He saw her face. He said, "How much rock?" That was the conversation. That was the whole conversation in 11 words. She said, 40 foot wide, 4 foot high at the deep place. Wendell wiped his hands on a rag. He said, limestone or sandstone? She said, limestone. From the quarry, the east fence. He said, clay? She said, creek bottom. He said, when? She said, after the wheat, before the corn needs cultivating. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. He said, all right, Mrs. Whitfield. He had been calling her Mrs. Whitfield for 19 years. He would call her Mrs. Whitfield until the day he died. She had asked him once, in 1962, to call her Nora. He had looked at her like she'd asked him to fly, so she had stopped asking. She went back to the house. She wrote in her notebook under the gauge reading, Wendell agreed. Start second week of May. God help us. Then she sat at the table and made a list of stone. She made the list in pencil. The pencil was the same brand of pencil her father had used. Dixon Ticonderoga. She bought them in boxes of 12 from Briggs's co-op every January. Hollis Briggs always raised his eyebrows when she bought the pencils, as if to say, "You and your father, you and your pencils." But he never said it out loud, and he rang them up, and he put them in a brown paper bag, and she carried them home and put them in the drawer with the rest. She sat at the table. She made the list. She did not cry. The first Friday of May was a co-op day. Every farmer in Calhoun County, or every farmer who counted himself as one, came to the Kettle Creek co-op on the first Friday of every month. They came for coffee that was bad, and seed prices that were worse, and conversation that was the same conversation they had been having for 40 years. They came because the co-op was the closest thing to a courthouse the county had. Nora came too. She always came. She came because not coming would have been worse than coming. She drove the old Ford pickup, the same one Henry had bought in 1964, the one with the bench seat and the radio that only got AM, and she parked at the side of the building because the front spots were for the men who came early to drink coffee on the bench out front. She walked across the gravel. She wore a clean cotton dress and a sweater because the May morning still had a bite, and she wore work boots because they were the only shoes she had that fit comfortably anymore, and she carried a small handbag that had belonged to her mother, who had died in 1948. She walked through the door. The bell rang. 3 or 4 heads turned. 3 or 4 heads turned back. And there it was, on the bulletin board, right next to the auction flyers and the church notices and the typewritten sheet listing the new wheat varieties. A cartoon, hand-drawn, pen and ink, a stick figure in a long dress and a wide-brimmed hat, stacking a wall of rocks while a fat cloud rained down on top of her. Beneath the cartoon, in block letters, Whitfield Waterworks, holding back the heavens since 1976. She looked at it. She looked at it for 3 seconds. She did not change her face. She walked to the counter. Hollis Briggs was behind the counter. He was 48 years old and had a wife he didn't deserve and a daughter who had married badly. And he was the kind of man who took his small pleasures where he could get them. He saw her come in. He saw her see the cartoon. He made his face pleasant. "Morning, Eleanor?" She said, "Morning, Hollis. I need 10 pounds of seed corn, the Pioneer 3306, and a box of pencils, Ticonderoga number 2. He said, "You want me to put that on your account?" She said, "Cash today." She paid him. He counted her change twice. She let him. She picked up the seed corn. She picked up the pencils. She turned around. The cartoon was still there. 2 men at the bench by the window were watching her over their coffee cups. One of them, a man whose name she could not remember but whose face she had known for 30 years, raised his cup at her in a kind of small salute. She did not nod. She did not smile. She walked out. Wendell was waiting at the truck. He took the seed corn from her. He put it in the bed. He climbed into the passenger side. He said, "You see the picture?" She said, "I saw it." He said, "You want me to pull it down?" She said, "No." He said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. She started the truck. She drove home. And as she drove, with the windows down and the May wind coming in across the wheat, she thought about her father. She thought about how in 1934, when she was 25 years old and pregnant with her first child, who was lost in the 7th month and never named, her father had said to her, "People are going to be wrong about you your whole life. The trick is not to make them right." She had not understood him at the time. She had been 25 years old. She was 67 years old now. She understood him fine. The second week of May, they started. They started at the narrowing below the sycamore, where the limestone shelved out from both banks and gave them a foundation. The shelf had been there since the last ice age. The creek had been there for 10,000 years. The sycamore was at least 120 years old because Nora's father had measured it in 1903 and recorded its trunk diameter in the first notebook, and she had measured it again every 20 years. And the math was the math. They hauled stone. Wendell drove the flatbed. Nora drove the tractor with the front loader. They took the limestone slabs out of the old quarry on the east fence line, 2 slabs at a time, and they hauled them down to the creek, and they unloaded them by hand and by bar, and they did it 6 days a week. The seventh day, they rested. That was her father's rule. By the end of May, they had moved 78 slabs. By the middle of June, they had moved 150. Nora kept count in her notebook. Her hands cracked open along the heels. She wrapped them in gauze and kept working. Wendell wrapped his in the same gauze without being asked. They didn't talk about it. They just worked. The first week of June, Darrell Purcell drove by. He slowed down. He didn't stop. He looked at them out the window of his Chevrolet. Wendell bent at the waist, setting a stone. Nora ankle-deep in the creek, packing clay between the stones with her bare hands. Darrell Purcell drove on. The second week of June, he drove by again. This time he stopped. He rolled down his window. He called across the field, "Eleanor." She straightened up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over to the fence line. "Darrell, that's coming along." "It is." "How big you planning to make her?" 40 foot wide, 4 foot tall at the deep place. About 9 acre-feet of storage when she fills. He laughed. He laughed the way he had laughed in April. Big chest, open mouth, the laugh of a man who needed other men to hear him. There were no other men. There was just the wind. He laughed anyway. "Eleanor," he said, "I'm going to send my grandkids down to swim in your puddle." She looked at him. She looked at him the way a person looks at a piece of weather they can't change. She said, "Drive safe, Darrell." She walked back to the creek. He sat in his car for another minute. Then he rolled up his window. Then he drove on. That night at the kitchen table, she wrote in her notebook, June 14th. Darrell came by, same as always. Wendell pretended not to hear him. Wendell is a kinder man than he gets credit for. Stones placed today, 11. Total, 174. Pool depth at gauge will reach 4 feet by the third week of July if the rains hold. They will hold. They are still holding for now. She closed the notebook. She put out the lamp. She went upstairs to bed in the room she had shared with Henry for 39 years, and she lay on her side of the bed, which she still kept to even though there was no one to share it with. And she did not sleep for an hour and 20 minutes. And then she did. The next morning, somebody knocked on her door. It was not Wendell. Wendell did not knock. Wendell came in through the back porch and started the coffee. This was the front door. Somebody at the front door. Nora was at the kitchen table in her robe, with her hair not yet braided, with the kerosene lamp still warm from breakfast. She froze for a second, because nobody came to the front door. Nobody had come to the front door since Henry's funeral. She put down her cup. She got up. She walked through the front room. She opened the door. A young woman was standing on the porch. The young woman was holding a basket. The basket had a checked cloth over it. Under the cloth was the smell of fresh bread. The young woman was perhaps 26, 27. Hair the color of new straw, pulled back in a knot. Eyes that didn't drop when Nora looked at her. The young woman said, "Mrs. Whitfield?" Nora said, "Yes." The young woman said, "My name is Elsbeth Hanley. My husband is Bert Hanley. He farms the section on the east side of the county road, north of the creek bend." Nora knew Bert Hanley. Bert Hanley was 29. He had inherited his father's place in 1973. He was a quiet young man who had been at the co-op the last time Nora was there, but had not laughed. Nora said, "I know your husband." Elsbeth Hanley said, "He doesn't know I'm here." That was the thing to say. Nora let the silence sit. Elsbeth Hanley said, "My father worked for your father. In 1920. He was 19. He helped your father dig the second pond, the one behind the machine shed." Nora said, "What was his name?" Elsbeth said, "Marlin Coombs." Nora closed her eyes for a second. She remembered Marlin Coombs. He had been a slow, kind boy with a stammer, who had eaten Sunday supper with the Briarwoods 3 or 4 times when Nora was 11 and 12 years old. He had died, she thought, sometime in the 1950s. She had not been to the funeral. She opened her eyes. She said, Your father was a good man. Elsbeth said, He's still alive, ma'am. He's 75. Nora said, Oh, she said it small. She said it like a person who has just learned something embarrassing about themselves. The world had been moving while she'd been measuring water. Elsbeth held up the basket. She said, I brought bread, and I have a question. If you have time. I know you don't owe me time. Nora looked at the young woman on her porch, 26 years old, or so, standing in front of a 67-year-old widow at 8 in the morning, holding a basket of bread, holding a question. Nora opened the door wider. She said, Come in. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table. The notebook was still there. Nora moved it aside. Elsbeth set the basket down and folded back the cloth, and the smell of the bread filled the kitchen, and Nora realized she had not had a piece of fresh bread baked by anyone else's hands since Henry died. She put on the kettle. She made coffee. She didn't ask the question yet. She let the young woman have her time. When the coffee was poured, when the bread was cut, when both of them had food and drink in front of them, Elsbeth Hanley said, My father told me your father was the smartest man he ever knew. Nora said, He was a careful man. Elsbeth said, He said your father could walk the creek bank in February and tell you whether June would be wet or dry. Nora said, He could. Elsbeth said, I want to know what you see, that they don't. Nora set down her cup. She looked at the young woman across her table. She thought for 1 second about lying, about saying, I'm just an old woman with a foolish project, about making the conversation small, the way she had made every conversation small for 5 years, because making conversation small had been the way she'd kept her grief from drowning her. Then she thought about Marlin Coombs, slow, kind, stammering Marlin Coombs, who was 75 and still alive, and had told his daughter a story about her father. She got up. She went to the cabinet in the front room. She opened the cabinet. She took out the notebooks, all 12 of them, bound in brown leather, stacked the way her father had stacked them. The oldest one with the year 1903 tooled into the cover in his own hand. She brought them to the kitchen table. She set them down between the bread and the coffee. She said, Sit closer. I'll need the lamp. Elsbeth moved her chair. The lamp came on, and for the next 3 hours on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June 1976, in a farmhouse kitchen in Calhoun County, Kansas, a 67-year-old widow opened 73 years of weather records to a 26-year-old young woman whose father had once helped dig a pond. Nora showed her the gauge readings. Nora showed her the rainfall by month. Nora showed her the first frost dates and the last frost dates and the creek levels in March and April and August and October, year after year after year. She showed her the column where, in 1925, her father had written Nora measured today, and the date and the number Nora had taken. She showed her the column where, in 1959, the year her father died, Nora had taken every reading alone for the first time and had written at the bottom of the page, in her own hand, he would have liked the rain in May. She showed her the page in 1971. The page in 1971 had a black border drawn around the August entries. She did not explain the black border. Elsbeth did not ask. By 11 in the morning, the bread was gone, the coffee had been refilled twice, and Elsbeth Hanley was leaning forward over the 1962 notebook with her hair coming loose from its knot, and she was saying, It's shorter. The wet years, they're shorter. Nora said, Yes. Elsbeth said, By how much? Nora said, By enough. Elsbeth said, And the dry ones, they're closer. Nora said, Yes. Elsbeth said, How long have you known? Nora said, I've known for 10 years. I've been sure for 3. Elsbeth said, Why didn't you tell anybody? Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I tried. She said it softly. She said it the way you say a thing you've been carrying. I told Henry in 1968. He believed me. He started to plan. Then in 71 he died. She drew a breath. I told Larry, my son. He thought I was working too hard. He's the reason I haven't told anyone else. Because if my own son thought it was an old woman's worry, what were Hollis Briggs and Darrell Purcell going to think? She picked up her cup. She drank. She said, so I stopped telling, and I started building. Elsbeth Hanley sat back in her chair. She looked at the 12 notebooks on the table. She looked at the woman across from her. She said, my husband thinks you're crazy. Nora said, I know he does. Elsbeth said, he's going to think I'm crazy too. When I tell him? Nora said, probably. Elsbeth said, I'm going to tell him anyway. And Nora Whitfield, who had not cried at her husband's funeral, who had not cried when her son had not come home for it, who had not cried when she'd found the cartoon on the co-op wall, felt the inside of her chest do something it had not done in a long time. She did not cry. Even then. But she nodded. Once, she said, then I'm glad you came. Elsbeth Hanley left at 11:30. She left with her empty basket and her hair coming down and a piece of paper in her hand, on which Nora had drawn, in pencil, a rough sketch of the dam and the gauge stake and the line where the ditch would run. She left with 73 years of weather in her head. She walked down the porch steps and across the gravel to her own pickup, and she climbed in, and she sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Nora watched from the porch. Elsbeth started the truck. She drove down the lane. She did not look back. The summer went on. The men kept laughing. They laughed less by July because the wheat came in heavy and the corn was tall, and there were other things to talk about. But they laughed enough. The cartoon stayed on the bulletin board through June. Somebody pinned a second one up in July, less mean than the first one. A stick figure pointing at the sky and saying, I told it not to rain. The two cartoons sat there together, like a pair, for the rest of the summer. Nora went to the co-op 3 more times. Each time she saw them. Each time she did not change her face. She bought her seed. She bought her pencils. She paid in cash. She went home. She worked. She and Wendell worked through the worst of the July heat. They worked in the early mornings and in the long evenings, and they took the middle of the day for rest. They drank water out of mason jars she filled at the kitchen sink. Wendell never complained about anything. Nora never complained about anything. They placed stones. They packed clay. They built a wooden spillway out of oak planks Wendell had cut himself in the winter of 1974, and they set it on the north end of the dam, where the bank rose slightly, so that the overflow in the spring flood years would have somewhere to go. By the 3rd week of July, the dam was finished, 40 feet wide, 4 feet high at the deep place, limestone face, clay-packed core, oak spillway. The summer rains had been thin but steady, and the pool behind the dam was already filling. By the end of July, it had reached a depth of 4 feet at the gauge stake. By the 2nd week of August, it had reached 5. Nora wrote in her notebook every evening. She wrote the depth. She wrote the weather. She wrote the wind direction and the cloud cover and the temperature at noon. And one evening, the last evening of July, she walked down to the pool by herself. The sun was going down. The light on the water was the color of old copper. Wendell was in the barn. The dogs were somewhere in the south pasture. The wheat had been combined 2 weeks before. The corn was tall and green in the bottom field. She stood on the crest of the dam. She put her hand on one of the top stones. She had set this stone herself in July, with Wendell holding the end of the bar while she packed clay under it. It was a heavy slab, almost too heavy for her, and she had set it anyway, because if she didn't set at least one of them with her own hands, she would not have built it. She would only have asked for it to be built. She put her hand on the stone. She did not pray. She had stopped praying in 1971, the August after Henry died, on a hot Sunday afternoon when she had decided that whatever was listening was not listening to her in particular. She did not pray. She thought about her father. She thought about her brother Howard, who had been dead for 33 years. She thought about Henry. She thought about Larry, who lived in Wichita. She thought about Elsbeth Hanley, who had come to the door 6 weeks before, with a basket of bread and a question. She thought, they don't know yet. She thought, they will. She thought, or they won't, and I'll have done it anyway. The sun went down. The wind picked up out of the south. Somewhere across the county, a screen door slammed. Nora Whitfield took her hand off the stone. She walked back up to the house. She lit the lamp. She opened the notebook. She wrote, pool depth at gauge, July 31st, 1976, 5 feet 2 inches. Estimated storage, 6.1 acre feet. Still filling. They are still laughing. They haven't seen anything yet. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. And outside, in the dark, in the pool behind the dam, the water rose another quarter inch by morning. The summer of 1977 came in dry. Not bad. Not yet. Just dry. The April rains were thin. The May rains stopped on the 18th. June was hot from the first day to the last. Nobody talked about it much. Farmers don't. Farmers wait. Roland Mossman waited. Darrell Purcell waited. Hollis Briggs waited behind the counter at the co-op and rang up seed and ammunition and pencils and made his small jokes and waited. Nora Whitfield did not wait. Nora Whitfield opened a check gate. She opened it on the morning of the 3rd of July, in the cool gray of just before sunrise, with Wendell standing 20 feet downstream holding a shovel, and she lifted the wooden gate by its iron handle, and the water came. The water came slow. The water came clean. The water came down the hand-dug ditch she and Wendell had cut along the east edge of the bottom field, and it ran the length of the corn rows, and it sank into the soil between the plants, and the plants drank. 80 acres. That's what she could reach with the ditch in 1977. 80 acres of corn in the bottom field, fed by gravity from a pool that held 9 4/10 acre-feet of water behind a wall of limestone and clay her neighbors had laughed at for 15 months. She watched the water move. She watched it for an hour. She didn't say anything. Wendell didn't say anything. The sun came up. The corn drank. That was July. By the 3rd week of August, the difference was visible from the road. You could see it from the county road. You could stand at the corner where the county road met the section line, and you could look north, and you could see, on the right-hand side, a field of corn that was tall and dark green and standing straight up like it was 1965. And on the left-hand side, you could see corn that was alive but tired. Corn that was thinking about giving up. Darrell Purcell drove past that corner 4 times a week. He stopped driving past it. He started taking the long way home. But Hollis Briggs saw it. Roland Mossman saw it. A young farmer named Bert Hanley saw it. And Bert Hanley pulled his pickup off the shoulder one Saturday afternoon and sat in his cab for 10 minutes with both hands on the wheel and didn't say a word. And when he got home for supper, his wife Elsbeth looked at his face and said, "You drove past her place." He said, "I did." She said, "What did you see?" He said, "She's right." He said it flat. The way a man says a thing he doesn't yet know how to carry. Elsbeth Hanley did not say "I told you." She did not say it because she was 27 years old and her husband was 29, and they had 2 small children and a mortgage at the First Savings Bank of Calhoun. And she knew that the thing she had wanted him to see for 15 months he had now seen on his own. Which was better. She poured him coffee. She let him sit. That night, after the children were down, Bert Hanley pulled a piece of newsprint out of the kitchen drawer and a pencil from the cup by the sink, and he sat at his own kitchen table and he started to draw. He drew his creek. He drew the bend where the limestone shelved. He drew where the dam might go. Elsbeth watched him from the doorway. She did not interrupt. She had learned in 7 years of marriage when not to interrupt. The harvest of 1977 came in. The county average for corn was 53 bushels. Nora Whitfield's bottom field, the 80 acres she had run water on from the 3rd of July to the 2nd of September, came in at 112. She paid her note at First Savings on the 12th of November. She drove home. She wrote in her notebook, "Bottom field, 112. Pool drawdown for the season, 4.8 acre-feet. Refill projected by April, One dry summer is not a drought. They will say I got lucky. Let them. Then she added in smaller letters underneath, Henry would have liked this number. December was cold. December was always cold. Christmas Eve, 1977. A truck came up the lane. Nora was in the kitchen. She was rolling out pie dough. She had not made a pie in 2 years, not since Henry's last Christmas, and she had decided that morning, with no warning and no explanation, that she was going to make a pie. She heard the truck. She did not move at first. Then she put down the rolling pin. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the front room. She looked out the window. The truck was a brown Chevrolet she did not recognize. It came up the lane slowly. It stopped in front of the porch. The driver's door opened. A man got out. He was tall. He was 38 years old. He had Henry's shoulders. He had her father's chin. He was her son. Lawrence Whitfield, who had not been on this property since August of 1968, stood in the driveway in the snow in a wool overcoat she had never seen before, and he looked up at the porch, and he saw her at the window, and he raised one hand. Just one hand. Just a small raise. A wave, a question, a 9-year-old apology. She put her hand to her mouth. She did not move. The passenger door opened. A young woman got out. Brown coat, brown hair pinned up, tired eyes. The back door opened. A small boy got out, 5 years old, red coat, red mittens, holding the young woman's hand. A boy she had never met, her grandson. The young woman looked up at the porch. Larry said something to them. Then Larry walked up the steps, alone, leaving them in the driveway. He stopped at the door. He took off his hat. He looked at her through the glass. She opened the door. She did not hug him. She could not. She did not know how. He said, "Mama?" She said, "Lawrence?" He said, "I should have called." She said, "You should have." He said, "Can we come in?" She stepped back. She held the door. She said, "Bring the boy in out of the cold." His wife was Adele. His wife was 34. His wife was a school librarian. His wife had grown up in Hutchinson and had never been on a working farm, and she stood in Nora's front room with snow melting off her boots and looked at the framed photograph of Clarence Briarwood over the mantel and did not say anything for a full minute. The boy was Clarence. The boy was named for his great-grandfather. The boy was 5. His face was round. His eyes were brown. He looked in a way that did something to Nora's chest, like Howard had looked at 5, like the brother she had buried in 1943. Nora made coffee. Nora made hot chocolate for the boy. Nora went back to the kitchen and rolled out the pie dough with the boy watching from a stool at the end of the counter, and she let him have a scrap of dough to play with, and he rolled it into a snake, and she put the snake on a piece of wax paper and slid it into the oven with the pie. And when the pie came out, his snake came out too, golden brown, and his face when he saw it. His face. She had to turn away. She had to turn away because she had not been prepared for a child's face on Christmas Eve. Larry was in the front room. Adele was helping the boy. Nora walked out to the porch with her shawl pulled tight, and she stood in the dark for 30 seconds, and she got her face back. She came inside. The boy ate his snake. Larry did not say anything about the dam. He did not say anything about the cartoon at the co-op. He did not say anything about the letter he had written her in March of 1976. He sat in his father's chair by the front room stove, and he held a cup of coffee in both hands. And he watched his mother and his wife and his son in her kitchen, and he was quiet. He was a quiet man now. He had not been a quiet boy. Nora wondered when that had changed. After supper, after the boy was put to bed in the small upstairs room that had been Larry's room 20 years before, after Adele had gone up to sit with him until he fell asleep, Larry stayed at the kitchen table. He stayed. Nora poured more coffee. She sat across from him. The kerosene lamp was between them. She waited. He looked at the lamp. He said, "I read your letter back." She said, "Which one?" He said, The one you didn't send. About the dam. The one in my drawer at home. From 1968. She set down her cup. He said, I found it in October. I was looking for something else. She said, I didn't think you kept those. He said, I kept all of them. She said, oh. He said, Mama, about Daddy? She said, don't. He said, please, let me. She said nothing. He said, I should have come home. She said, yes. He said, I have told myself for 6 years that I had a reason. I have told myself that work was the reason, that money was the reason, that Adele had been sick that fall, that the baby was small. I have told myself everything except the truth. She waited. He said, I was angry because I had asked you and Daddy to sell the land, and you said no. And I had moved to Wichita to get away from that no. And when he died, I told myself I didn't owe him a funeral. He said it. He said all of it, in one breath, like a man who had been holding his breath for 9 years. Nora did not move. Outside, the wind came across the wheat stubble and pressed against the kitchen window. She said very quietly, he did not blame you. Larry said, yes, he did. She said, no, Lawrence, he didn't. He was hurt. Hurt is not blame. He died hurt. But he did not die angry with you. Larry put his face in his hands. He did not cry out loud. He was a Whitfield. Whitfield men cried the way Whitfield men did everything, quietly, with their hands. Nora reached across the table. She did not take his hand. She put her own hand, palm down, on the table between them. After a moment, he reached out and put his hand on top of hers. She let it stay. The lamp burned. The wind blew. After a while, she said, Lawrence, I need to tell you something about your father. He looked up. She said, he did not die of a bad heart. He said, Mama, the doctor said. She said, I know what the doctor said. I'm telling you what I saw. He waited. She said, 1971 was a drought year. You weren't here. You were already gone. Your father worked 18 hours a day from the 1st of June to the 1st of September, hauling water, pumping the well, trying to save the corn. He was 62 years old. He had a heart that had always been a little weak. He knew it was weak. He worked anyway, because he was afraid of the bank. He was afraid of losing the land your grandfather had given us. She drew in a breath. She said, he died on the 11th of August, in the south field, with the tractor running. Larry said, Mama? She said, I made a promise that day, Lawrence. I made it standing over him before they came to take him. I promised your grandfather, and I promised your father, and I promised your Uncle Howard that no Whitfield was going to be killed by a dry year on this land again. She stopped. She said, that is what the dam is. Larry was very still. He said, why didn't you tell me? She said, because I needed you to come back on your own. He said, Mama? She said, and you came back on your own, tonight. You drove yourself up the lane. He put his head down again. This time she put her hand on the back of his neck. She had not touched her son in 9 years. His hair was thinning. He was 38. She had not noticed in the doorway how much like his father he had become. She held her hand there. She said, it's all right, Lawrence. She said, it is. The pie was on the counter. Adele came down at 9:30. She found them at the table with empty cups, and the lamp burned low, and she had the sense, the way some women have a sense, not to ask anything. She said, the pie smells wonderful, Mrs. Whitfield. Nora said, Eleanor, or Nora, either one. Please. Adele said, Eleanor. Nora said, sit with us. They sat. They did not eat the pie that night. They saved it for Christmas Day. At 10:30, Adele yawned. Nora said, go up. The boy will be up early. Adele went up. Larry stayed. When the stairs stopped creaking, Larry said, I would like to learn it. The land, the notebooks, the dam. Nora said, it would take years. He said, I have years. She said, I am 68 this winter. He said, I know. She said, Wendell is 63. He said, I know. She said, Lawrence, don't promise me anything tonight. Tonight is just a Christmas Eve. He said, Mama? She said, don't. He said, all right. She said, come back in the spring. If you still mean it, come back in April when the creek is up. We'll start then. He said, all right. That was the promise. That was the unspoken promise sitting between them on the table next to the empty coffee cups. He didn't come back in the spring. He came back at the end of the summer, which was a different kind of coming back. The summer of 1978 began wrong. The April rains never materialized. That's the sentence. 5 words. It is a sentence that, if you have lived on a farm, you read with your stomach. By the middle of May, the creek was running at half its normal level. Nora measured it every morning. She wrote the numbers down. She did not say them out loud. By the 1st of June, Darrell Purcell had put a deeper pump in his well. It cost him $1,100. He did not have $1,100 to spare. He borrowed it from the bank in Topeka because First Savings had not yet decided whether to extend his operating note. And the deeper pump was the kind of move a man makes when he is trying not to look afraid. By the 4th of July, Roland Mossman's corn was showing tip dieback. By the 14th of July, the county extension agent, a young man named Curtis Mount, drove out to 3 different farms in 2 days and went back to his office and sat at his typewriter and used the word drought in a letter to the state agricultural office for the first time in 15 years. The word drought, the word that nobody at the co-op wanted to hear out loud. Hollis Briggs took down the second cartoon in early July. He didn't say anything when he took it down. He just took it down. The first one stayed up. The first one stayed up because Hollis Briggs was a man who took small pleasures where he could get them, and he was not yet ready to admit that the pleasure had turned into something else. Nora kept coming to the co-op. She kept buying her seed. She kept buying her pencils. She kept paying in cash. She did not look at the cartoon. She did not need to. Elsbeth Hanley started coming to the farm every Tuesday morning. She brought bread. She brought by the 3rd Tuesday another young woman with her, a woman named May Dorfler, who was 28 and had married into a 160-acre farm 3 miles east of the Hanleys, and who had heard, the way women hear things, that Nora Whitfield was teaching young farmers' wives how to read the weather. By the 5th Tuesday, there was a 3rd. By the 7th Tuesday, there was a 4th. They sat at Nora's kitchen table. They drank her coffee. They ate the bread Elsbeth brought, and they looked at the notebooks. Nora did not lecture them. Nora did not perform. Nora just opened the notebooks, one at a time, and she let them ask questions. And she answered the questions, and she wrote in pencil on a fresh sheet of paper what each woman would need to start a notebook of her own. The 4th woman was named Hazel Truitt. Hazel Truitt was 31. Her husband Earl ran 190 acres of mixed corn and milo on the south end of the county. Hazel had been to the co-op once with her husband and had heard a joke about Whitfield Waterworks, and she had looked at her husband to see if he laughed, and her husband had laughed, and Hazel had gone home and not spoken to her husband for the rest of the evening. And the next morning she had asked Elsbeth Hanley, at the Tuesday quilting circle at the Lutheran church, if it was true that Eleanor Whitfield was teaching women to read weather. Elsbeth had said, come next Tuesday. Hazel came. Hazel was the one who, in the 2nd week of August, looked up from the 1934 notebook with her finger on a column of rainfall numbers from the Dust Bowl and said, Eleanor, this is happening again, isn't it? Nora said, yes. Hazel said, how bad? Nora said, not as bad as 34. Not yet, but the shape of it is the same shape. Hazel said, what do I tell Earl? Nora said, you tell him to dig. Hazel said, dig what? Nora said, anything. A pond, a ditch, a diversion, anything that holds water that he didn't have last year. Hazel was quiet. Then Hazel said, he won't listen to me. Nora said, "He will. He won't say he is, but he will." Hazel went home. Hazel did not say anything to her husband for 3 days. On the fourth day, at breakfast, she set a piece of paper down on the table next to his coffee cup. On the paper, she had drawn, in her own hand, a sketch of his South Creek and a possible location for a small earthen pond. Earl Truitt looked at the paper. He looked at his wife. He looked at the paper again. He said, "Did Eleanor Whitfield draw this?" Hazel said, "I drew it." He said, "Did she help?" Hazel said, "She taught me how to draw it. I drew it." Earl Truitt was 41 years old. He had laughed at Whitfield Waterworks in the spring of 1976, and he had laughed at it in the summer of 1977. And he was a man who was beginning, by August of 1978, to understand that he had been laughing at something he did not understand. He picked up the paper. He folded it. He put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "I'll think on it." He did not laugh. That was the change. That was the shape of the change in Calhoun County in the summer of 1978. Slow, quiet, around kitchen tables, through paper passed from wife to husband, through young men driving past Nora Whitfield's bottom field at sundown and pulling their pickups onto the shoulder. But the loudest man in the county hadn't changed yet. The loudest man in the county was about to. He just didn't know it. The thunderstorm came on the night of August 22nd. It came out of the southwest. It came hot and dry and full of wind. The kind of storm that comes in a drought year, when the air has been so dry for so long that the lightning has nowhere to ground itself but the earth. The kind of storm that does not bring rain. It brings fire. It came at 2:50 in the morning. Nora was asleep. She woke to a sound she did not at first recognize. A long, low boom. Not thunder. A different sound. She sat up. She went to the window. She saw on the eastern horizon the orange. The orange you do not want to see at 3 in the morning. The orange that means fire. She knew, the way a person knows, before she had even put her glasses on, whose place it was. Purcell, 3/4 of a mile east. Across the creek, across the county road, the Purcell barn. She stood at the window for 2 seconds. 2 seconds. She thought, that man laughed at you for 2 years? She thought, that man called your work a puddle. She thought, that man tried to buy your land from your dead husband's grave. She thought all of that. It took 2 seconds. Then she pulled on her dress over her nightgown. She pulled on her boots without socks. She ran down the stairs. She banged on the wall outside Wendell's bunk room. She yelled, "Wendell, get up! Purcell's barn is on fire." Wendell was up in 12 seconds. He was 64 years old and he was up in 12 seconds. They took the truck. They drove east. The truck bumped down the gravel road past the creek and past the section line and past the fence corner where the cartoon hadn't yet been thought of 2 years before. And they came up the Purcell Lane at 3:08 in the morning. And they saw. The barn was gone. That part was already over. The barn had been struck by the lightning at 2:50, and by 3:08, the barn was a frame of black sticks, and the equipment inside the barn was a melted shape that used to be a combine, and there was nothing to be done about the barn. The house was the question. The house was 40 feet from the barn. The wind was out of the southwest at 18 miles an hour. The wind was carrying sparks. Darrell Purcell was standing in his front yard in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt and no shoes. He was standing in his front yard with the garden hose in his hands. He was pointing the garden hose at his roof. The garden hose was producing a thin, weak, almost useless stream of water because his well had been dropping all summer and his pump was straining and the pressure in his line was less than half of what it should have been. He looked like a man trying to put out a forest fire with a coffee cup. His wife Vivian was on the porch. Vivian Purcell, 58 years old, in a robe and slippers. She was holding a quilt against her chest. Just a quilt. The one her mother had made her in 1939. She was holding the quilt against her chest and watching her husband try to save the house with a garden hose. She was not crying. She was past crying. Nora pulled the truck up. Wendell was out before the truck stopped moving. Nora was out 1 second behind him. She didn't say anything to Daryl. She didn't even look at him. She ran to the back of the truck. She and Wendell pulled out the long coil of fire hose Henry had bought in 1968 for the threshing crew, the one she had carried in the back of the pickup every summer since, because her father had said fire is the only thing that scares a farmer more than drought. They unspooled it. Wendell connected one end to the spigot on the side of the Purcell house. Nora connected the other end to the spigot on her truck-mounted water tank, which she carried in the bed of the pickup all summer because it was 1978 and it was August, and she had taught herself, since 1971, to never go anywhere without 200 gallons of water in the back of her truck. She turned the valve. The hose jumped. Water came. Real water. She handed the nozzle to Daryl Purcell. She didn't say a word. She just put it in his hand. He stared at her for half a second. Then he turned and started spraying his roof. Wendell started another line off the truck tank to the porch. Nora went up the porch steps to Vivian. She didn't say it's going to be all right. She didn't say, don't cry. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around her. Vivian Purcell, the woman whose husband had drawn a stick figure cartoon of Nora's life and pinned it to a corkboard. The woman who had baked the casserole Daryl had brought up Nora's lane in 1972. The woman who had probably laughed, in her own kitchen, at her own husband's jokes. Nora put her arms around her. Vivian made a small sound. A small, terrible sound. Like a sound a child makes when she is trying not to. She put her face into Nora's shoulder. Nora held her. She held her for as long as it took. Behind them, the men worked the hoses. The wind shifted. The wind shifted at 3:22 in the morning. The wind came out of the north for 2 full minutes, and in those 2 minutes, the sparks that had been crossing toward the house stopped crossing toward the house. In those 2 minutes, Wendell got the porch wet enough that the next sparks didn't take. In those 2 minutes, Daryl Purcell soaked his roof. By 4 in the morning, the barn was a pile of embers, and the house was wet and standing, and the wind had calmed, and the rain that the storm had been promising all night still had not come. But the fire was out. Vivian Purcell was sitting on the porch steps. She was still holding the quilt. Daryl Purcell was standing in his front yard with the nozzle in his hands and water running off his face and down his neck. And he was looking at his barn, and he was not saying anything. Nora walked down off the porch. She walked across the yard. She stopped 6 feet from him. He turned to look at her. He had soot on his face. He had no shoes on. He was 62 years old in that moment. He looked 80. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. She said, Daryl, go to bed. He said, Eleanor. She said, go to bed. You can think tomorrow. Right now, go to bed. He looked at her. He looked at her for 3 seconds. She had never in 2 years looked at him like that. She had looked at him with patience. She had looked at him with politeness. She had looked at him once or twice with something a person could mistake for forgiveness. She had never looked at him with this. This was not forgiveness. This was the look of a woman who had work to do tomorrow. He said very quietly, thank you. She said, go to bed. She turned. She walked back to her truck. Wendell was already coiling the hose. They drove home in silence. The sun came up at 6:14. She didn't go back to bed. She made coffee. She drank it on the porch in her nightgown and her dress and her wet boots, and she watched the eastern sky, and she did not cry, and she did not talk, and she did not write in the notebook. She wrote in the notebook 2 days later when she had her breath back. She wrote, August 22nd, 1978. Purcell barn struck by lightning. Wendell and I drove the truck tank over. We got the house wet. The barn was lost. Vivian is unhurt. Daryl is unhurt. Neither one of them is the same. Then she wrote in smaller letters, a woman cried on my shoulder tonight who I have never once spoken to in 25 years of being her neighbor. I do not understand how a person lives that long beside another person and never says a word. I do not understand why we let our husbands decide who we are allowed to speak to. I'm 69 years old, and I'm only beginning to understand this. The harvest of 1978 came in the third week of October. The county average for corn was 47 bushels. Nora Whitfield's bottom corn, the 80 acres, came in at 106. She paid her note at First Savings on the 9th of November. Walter Crane stood up from behind his desk when she walked in. He shook her hand. He had not shaken her hand the year before. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." She said, "Mr. Crane." He said, "I'd like to put you on our Farmer Advisory Board, starting in January." She said, "I'll think about it." He said, "I hope you will." She said, "Mr. Crane, there's a woman named Hazel Truitt 3 miles south of my place. Her husband Earl is going to come in here in February and ask for a loan to dig a pond. I would like you to give it to him." Walter Crane looked at her. He said, "I see." She said, "He won't be the only one. There are 7 women I have been teaching. Their husbands will come in here next year asking for things. I would like the bank to listen." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, the bank will listen." She said, "Thank you." She left. She drove home. And that night, alone at her kitchen table, with the kerosene lamp burning low and the wind out of the north and the first hard freeze a week away, she sat with her notebook open in front of her, and she did not write anything for a long time. She did not write anything because she did not yet have the words. She had the feeling, though. She had the feeling of a woman who had carried a thing alone for a very long time, and who had, that summer, in a thunderstorm, set it down in the front yard of a neighbor she had once been told to despise, and had not picked it up again afterward. She picked up her pencil, finally, and she wrote, "The drought of 1978 is over. We came through. Wendell came through. The bottom corn came in at 106. Larry called from Wichita on Tuesday. He is coming back in the spring. He has told Adele. They have a buyer for the house. I do not yet believe it. I will believe it when I see his truck in the lane." She stopped. She added, "Darrell Purcell has not come to the fence yet. He will. He hasn't yet because he is a proud man and his pride is a slow thing. But he will come. I will know what to do when he does. I think." She closed the notebook. She put out the lamp. The spring of 1979 brought rain. Real rain. The kind that comes down in long, slow sheets in April and does not stop. The pool refilled by the second week of March. The creek ran full. The wheat came up dark green. And on the 18th of April, Wendell Mosley had a stroke. It was a Tuesday morning. He was in the equipment shed. He was greasing the cultivator. Nora found him on the concrete floor at 20 after 9, with the grease gun still in his right hand and his left side gone soft, and his eyes wide open and looking at her without seeing her quite right. She did not scream. She had stopped screaming years ago. She knelt down. She took the grease gun out of his hand. She put her face close to his. She said, "Wendell?" He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." She said, "Don't move." He said, "I won't." She drove to the road. She drove to the road and flagged down a milk truck, and the milk truck driver radioed for an ambulance. And the ambulance came from Calhoun in 22 minutes. And by 10:30, Wendell was in the hospital in Topeka. And by supper time, the doctors had said the words minor stroke and recovery and time. And Nora was sitting in a green plastic chair in a hospital corridor with her hands folded in her lap. She sat in that chair for 6 hours. She did not eat. She did not drink coffee. She sat in that chair until they let her in to see him, and she sat next to his bed for another 4 hours. And at midnight, a young nurse came in and said, "Ma'am, you have to go home." Nora said, "All right." She drove home in the dark. She drove home alone for the first time in 19 years, because there had always been Wendell. Wendell in the bunk room behind the barn. Wendell at breakfast at 6. Wendell in the equipment shed by 7. Wendell who never married. Wendell who had been her father's man and Henry's man and now her man, in the only way the word her man meant anything anymore. She drove home. She walked through the dark house. She did not turn on the lamp. She went upstairs. She lay on her side of the bed in her clothes. She did not sleep. Wendell came home 3 weeks later. He came home with his right arm working fine and his left arm working slow and his left foot dragging just enough that you could see it if you watched him for 10 seconds. He sat at her kitchen table. He drank coffee. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield." She said, "Wendell." He said, "I was going to go to Topeka, to my daughter's." She set down her cup. She said, "Are you?" He said, "I think I should." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I can't haul stone." She said, "I am not asking you to haul stone." He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I can't pull my weight." She said, "Wendell Mosley?" He looked up. She said, "You have pulled your weight in this house since 1957. You are not a piece of equipment. You are a person. You are not leaving this farm because your left side is slow." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. He said, "Then what do I do here?" She said, "You teach the boy." He said, "What boy?" She said, "The one I'm going to hire next week." His name was Jesse Holt. He was 21 years old. He had been raised by an aunt in Manhattan, Kansas, after his parents were killed in a car wreck on the Kansas Turnpike when he was 11. He had been working as a hired hand at the Mossman place since he was 17, and Roland Mossman, of all people, had told Nora about him in May of 1979, when Roland Mossman came up Nora's lane in his own truck for the first time in 3 decades to say, "Eleanor, I hear you might be looking for a young man." That sentence had cost Roland Mossman something to say. Nora had let him say it. Then she had said, "Tell him to come Thursday." Jesse Holt came Thursday. He came in a clean shirt that did not fit him quite right at the shoulders. He had a serious face. He took off his cap when he walked into the kitchen. He looked at Nora and he looked at Wendell and he said, "Ma'am, sir." Nora said, "Sit down, Mr. Holt." He sat. She said, "I need a young man who can work. I have a foreman who needs an apprentice. He'll teach you everything he knows. He knows a great deal. The pay is $22 a week and your room and board and 1 Sunday a month off. Are you interested?" He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because Mr. Mossman told me you keep the best ground in the county." Wendell snorted. Wendell almost never made sounds. Jesse looked at him. Wendell said, "Boy, can you mix clay?" Jesse said, "I never have." Wendell said, "You will." That was the interview. That was the whole interview. Jesse Holt moved into the bunk room on the south side of the barn the next Tuesday. Wendell kept the bunk room on the north side. They ate breakfast in Nora's kitchen at 6 in the morning. They worked together every day. By the end of the summer, Jesse Holt could pack clay between limestone slabs as well as Wendell could, and Wendell stood beside him with his left foot dragging slightly, telling him in a slow, even voice exactly what to do. The dam did not fail. The dam held all year. The fall of 1979 came in with good rains. The fall of 1980 came in with good rains. The fall of 1981 came in dry. The winter of 1981 came in dry. And by the time the snow that did not come had finished not falling on Calhoun County, Nora Whitfield was writing in her notebook the same shape of numbers she had read, as a young woman, in her father's 1933 entries. The winter of 1981 to 1982 brought no snow worth measuring. January, trace. February, trace. March, half an inch. The subsoil going into spring was already short. April brought 4 light rains that did not soak. May brought 3 rains, all of them under a quarter inch. June was dry from the first day to the last day. By the end of June, Kettle Creek was down to a trickle. She measured it on the morning of the 28th of June, 1982, and the number she wrote in her notebook was the lowest reading she had recorded since 1936, since the worst year of the Dust Bowl. That was the number that made her stop that morning with the pencil over the page and close her eyes. She closed her eyes. She thought, "Here it is." She thought, "Here is the year I built it for." She opened her eyes. She wrote the number. She did not pray. She had not prayed since 1971. She walked out of the kitchen. Wendell was on the porch. Wendell was 68 years old now, and Wendell was always on the porch in the mornings now, and he sat in the rocker with his coffee, and he watched the eastern fields. She said, Wendell. He said, Mrs. Whitfield. She said, get Jesse. Tell him the ditch is opening today. All of it. The east extension too. He said, yes, ma'am. He stood up. He stood up slow. He said, Mrs. Whitfield. She said, what? He said, Purcell's going to come. She said, I know he is. He said, what are you going to do when he does? She did not answer right away. She looked out across the wheat stubble toward the east, toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the Purcell property line. She said, I'm going to give him water, Wendell. He said, how much? She said, whatever I can spare. He said, yes, ma'am. He walked off the porch. The drought ran 14 weeks. By the third week of July, the talk at the co-op had changed. It wasn't a different conversation. It was the same conversation. It was just quieter. Hollis Briggs didn't tape any cartoons up. Hollis Briggs didn't talk much at all. By the second week of August, Roland Mossman had lost his first corn planting and replanted in late June at reduced population, and his replanted corn was suffering. And Roland Mossman, who was 61 years old, was sleeping 4 hours a night. 3 farmers south of the county road had applied to the state for emergency operating loans. Curtis Mount, the extension agent, had stopped using the word drought in his letters. He was using the word crisis. Nora's pool was at 8 feet 2 inches. Nora's pool was full. Nora's ditch was running. Her 120 acres of irrigated corn, the original 80 plus the 40 acres she and Wendell and Jesse had added in the spring of 1980, went into August with good color and full ears setting on the stalks. The Friday meetings at the kitchen table kept growing. There were 9 women now. Elsbeth Hanley still came. May Dorfler, Hazel Pruitt. A woman named Iola Pruitt, whose husband had finally, in March, started digging a small pond at the corner of his cornfield. A woman named June Vetter, whose husband had refused to dig anything, and who came anyway, with her sister's daughter from Topeka, who was studying biology at the university and who took notes for her aunt. 9 women. Nora poured the coffee. Elsbeth brought the bread. They had stopped asking questions about whether it was happening. They were asking questions about what to do next. The 4th Friday of July, 1982, somebody knocked on Nora's front door. It was not Elsbeth. Elsbeth came in through the kitchen. It was the front door. Nora was at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her, and she set down her pencil, and she walked through the front room, and she opened the door. Darrell Purcell was on the porch. He had his hat in his hands. He had not been to Nora's door in 10 years. He looked smaller. He had lost weight that summer. His face was tired. His shoulders had come down. He was 66 years old, and he was wearing a clean blue shirt, and his hat was in his hands, and he was looking at the floorboards of the porch. He said, Eleanor? She said, Darrell. He said, I have 30 acres of first-ear corn. That might still make something, if it gets water in the next 2 weeks. She said nothing. He said, everything else is gone. She said nothing. He said, I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay you whatever the water's worth. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Inside her chest, something was happening that she did not have a word for. It was not satisfaction. It was not anger. It was not even relief. It was older than any of those. It was the thing her father had been trying to teach her in 1925. She said, come in. He said, Eleanor, I can stand on the porch. She said, come in, Darrell. The wind is blowing dust. He came in. She walked him through the front room to the kitchen. She moved her notebook aside. She poured him coffee. His hand was shaking when he took the cup. She did not say anything about his hand. She sat down across from him. She said, how much corn? He said, 30 acres. She said, I can give you enough for 20. He looked up. He said, Eleanor. She said, 20. That's what I can spare. I have my own ground to keep alive, and there are others who may need to come. He said, how much? She said, no charge. He said, Eleanor, I will pay. She said, Daryl, no charge. Don't make me say it again. He set down the coffee cup. He put his hat on his knee. He looked at the table. His shoulders did a thing she had seen them do once before, 6 years before, in his own front yard, in the hour after his barn had burned. He did not speak for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was small. He said, I do not deserve this. She said, that is not the question. He said, Eleanor? She said, the rain doesn't care what we think, Daryl. It comes when it comes. The question is what we do in the years when it does come, so we're ready for the years when it doesn't. He nodded. He nodded like a man taking dictation. She said, Jesse will run the ditch to your west fence by Thursday. He said, Eleanor. She said, drink your coffee, Daryl, then go home and tell Vivian. He drank his coffee. He stood up. He turned at the doorway. He said, Eleanor? She said, what? He said, the cartoon, in the co-op. I drew it. She said, I know you did. He said, I'm sorry for it. She said, I know you are. He said, is there anything I can? She said, Daryl, go home. Tell Vivian. He went. She sat at the table. She did not write in the notebook for an hour. She just sat. By the end of August, 3 more men had come. They came one at a time. Roland Mossman came on a Monday at supper time. He stood at the gate. He didn't come to the porch. He waited until Nora walked out to him. She walked out to him, and he took off his hat, and he said, Mrs. Whitfield, I have 18 acres I could maybe save, if there's any to spare. And she had said yes to 10 of them. And she had walked back to the house, and she had recalculated her drawdown. A man named Cadet Pryor came on a Wednesday. He had been the loudest at the 1979 soil conservation meeting, where he had called Nora's dam a waste of limestone. He stood at the gate. He did not say, I'm sorry. He said, Mrs. Whitfield, I have 15 acres. She gave him enough for 10. A man named Earl Truitt, Hazel's husband, came on a Thursday morning. He came in his pickup with Hazel beside him. Hazel did not get out. Earl came up to the porch. He had built a small pond in the spring of 1981 on Hazel's drawing, but the pond was empty by August, and his corn was burning, and he stood on Nora's porch and he said, Mrs. Whitfield, ma'am, I drew the pond too small. She said, yes, Earl. He said, if there's water to spare? She said, there's enough for 12 acres. He said, Mrs. Whitfield. She said, it's all right, Earl. It's all right. Next year we'll draw a bigger pond. By the 1st of September, Nora Whitfield's stone dam was providing water to her own 120 acres and to portions of 4 neighboring farms. 5 families. 5 families were making their harvest because one woman had built a wall of creek stone 6 years before, while 4 men laughed at her from a fence line. The harvest of 1982 came in. The county average for corn was 31 bushels. 12 farmers in Calhoun County filed for emergency operating loans. 2 farms went to the bank before Christmas. Nora's irrigated ground came in at 94 bushels. 20 acres of Daryl Purcell's corn, fed by the ditch she had ordered Jesse to run on the Thursday, came in at 81 bushels. It was more or less the difference between Daryl Purcell making his note at First Savings and not making it. He made it. He made it because of her. And he came to her door. He came to her door on a Sunday evening in the 2nd week of October. This time he didn't come to the fence. He came to the door. He knocked. Nora opened it. She let him in. He sat at the kitchen table. He had brought a small paper bag. He set it on the table. He said, Vivian sent biscuits. Nora said, tell her thank you. He said, Eleanor, about 1976. She said, Daryl, you said it already, in August. Don't make us go through it twice. He said, I would like to. She looked at him. She said, all right. He said, I laughed at you in 1976. I called it a puddle. I drew the cartoon. I pinned it up. I made sure the other men laughed too. I thought I was being clever. I thought I knew what the world was. I thought women didn't read the weather. She let the silence sit. He said, I have thought about that every day this summer. I have thought about it every day since the barn burned, if I am being honest, which I have not been until tonight. She said, Daryl. He said, I am ashamed. She said, I know you are. He said, I don't know what to do with that. She said, you build. He said, what? She said, you build a wall on your creek. There's a narrowing about 100 yards north of your section line where the limestone shelves out from the east bank. You can use the same technique I used. Stone face, clay-packed core. I can show you how to set the spillway. He said, Eleanor, I am 66. She said, so am I. 67 this winter. 18 this winter if I'm counting Henry's, which I do. He looked at her. He said, you will help me. She said, I will help you. I will lend you my drawings from 1976. Jesse will come help you set stone if you need a third pair of hands. He set his coffee cup down. He said, I don't know how to accept this. She said, drink your coffee, Daryl. He drank his coffee. He stayed for an hour. At the door, he stopped. He said, Eleanor. She said, what? He said, Vivian asks if she might come for coffee, some morning. Nora was quiet for a second. Then she said, tell her Saturday mornings, 9 o'clock. The pot's always on by then. He said, all right. He went home. In the spring of 1983, Lawrence Whitfield came up the lane in a brown moving truck. He came up the lane with Adele beside him. He came up the lane with a small boy in the back seat. The boy was 9 now. The boy had his great-grandfather's name. The truck was full of furniture. The car behind the truck was full of more. Larry parked at the porch. He got out. He walked up the porch steps. His mother was waiting at the door. He said, Mama. She said, Lawrence. He said, I sold the house. Adele resigned. I gave my notice. We're here. For good, if you'll have us. She did not move at first. She did not move because she had been waiting 6 years to hear this, and she had stopped, in the last 2 years, believing she would. She put one hand against the doorframe. She said, bring my grandson in. Adele came up with the boy. The boy looked up at her. Nora knelt down on her 68-year-old knees, which she should not have done, and she put both her hands on his face. She said, Clarence, do you know who I am? He said, your grandma. She said, yes, I am. She stood up. She wiped her face once. She said, all of you, come in. The coffee's hot. The years moved. 1983 came and went, and the drought returned, lighter than 82, heavier than 78. Nora's system performed. The pool held. The corn made. Bert Hanley had built his own dam in March of 83, smaller than Nora's, 4 acre-feet. It held. His corn came in at 72 bushels in a 38-bushel year. Earl Truitt redrew his pond in the spring of 84. Twice as big this time. It filled. By the spring of 85, there were 6 small dams on the creeks of Calhoun County. By the spring of 86, there were 11. The Friday meetings at Nora's kitchen table kept happening. Elsbeth Hanley brought the bread. Vivian Purcell came on Saturday mornings. That was a different meeting. That was 2 women on a porch with coffee and a quilt and 40 years of silence to undo. They undid some of it, not all of it. Some things take longer than the time you've got. In the spring of 1985, Vivian Purcell was diagnosed with breast cancer. Nora was in the room. Nora was in the room at the hospital in Topeka because Vivian had asked her to come, because Daryl could not sit through the appointment, because Daryl, the loud man, the laughing man, the man who had drawn the cartoon, could not face a doctor giving his wife the news he had already half guessed from the way Vivian had been holding her arm against her side for 2 weeks. So Nora went. Nora held Vivian's hand in the green plastic chair in the doctor's office. Nora drove Vivian to chemotherapy in Topeka every other Wednesday for 11 months. Nora read to Vivian on those Wednesdays from her father's weather notebooks, because Vivian had said once in the kitchen, "Eleanor, the way you read those numbers, they sound like poems." She read them. Rainfall by month. First frost, last frost, creek level at the gauge stake. Vivian listened. Vivian got better. The cancer went into remission in the spring of 1986. She lived another 14 years. She made it to the year 2000. But that came later. For now, in 1986, the two women sat on Nora's porch on Saturday mornings, and they drank coffee, and they did not always speak, and the silence between them was not the silence of strangers anymore. Wendell Mosley sat in the rocker beside them, sometimes with his left foot dragging slightly and his coffee in his good hand. And he listened, and he smiled the small smile of a man who had watched something happen that he did not have to explain to anyone. In April of 1991, Nora Whitfield handed her son the farm. She was 82. Her right knee had decided the previous fall that it was done negotiating. She walked with a cane now. She walked with her father's cane, the one Clarence Briarwood had carried from 1955 until his death, the one with the carved handle her mother had made him for his 75th birthday. She walked out to the dam with Larry on the morning of the handover. It was the second week of April. The pool was full. The spillway was running a thin sheet of overflow that caught the morning light. She stopped on the crest. She put her hand on one of the top stones. She had set this stone herself in July of 1976, with Wendell holding the end of the bar, with a cartoon on the co-op wall, with her son in Wichita, with Henry 5 years dead, and her father 32 years dead, and Howard 48 years dead. She did not say any of that. She said, "Lawrence." He said, "Mama." She said, "Check the spillway boards every March, before the runoff. Replace any board that sounds hollow when you knock it. The clay on the north face needs repacking every 3 years. You'll know when it starts to seep." He wrote it in his notebook. He had his own notebook now. He had been keeping it since 1983. She said, "The pool gauge is the third post east of the sycamore. Don't move it. It is in the same place your grandfather drove it in 1903. He said, "I won't move it." She said, "There's a stone on the north crest, third from the east end. I said it myself. If it ever shifts, you'll know I'm in the ground." He looked at her. She did not let him answer. She turned around. She walked back up the rise with her cane and her father's slow, careful way, and her son walked beside her. And that was the whole ceremony. Wendell Mosley lived until the autumn of 1992. He was 78. He died in the rocker on Nora's porch on a Sunday afternoon in October, with his coffee cup half full and his eyes closed and a kind of peaceful weight in his face that Nora knew, the moment she stepped out onto the porch with his second cup, what she was looking at. She sat down beside him. She held his hand. His hand was still warm. She held it for 40 minutes before she went inside to call. She buried him on her own ground. She did it without asking anyone. She picked a place on a small rise above the creek, just south of the dam, where you could see the pool from the gravestone. She had the stone cut in Topeka. She had it brought out in a flatbed truck. The stone said, "Wendell Mosley, the man who carried water, 1914 to 1992. She paid for the stone herself. She stood at his grave alone the day the stone was set. She put one hand on the top of it. She said out loud, "Thank you, Wendell." Then she went home. She wrote in her notebook that night, "Wendell is buried above the creek. The stone is good. He was the best man I ever knew, my husband and my father included, and I'm only saying that because both of them would have said the same thing. There is no shame in it. He was the best of us." She closed the notebook. She slept badly. She slept badly for a long time, but she kept the notebook going. Larry came in mornings. Jesse Holt, who was 34 now, and who had married a girl from Salina in 1988, ran the day-to-day. Clarence, the boy, was 18 and headed for Kansas State in the fall. The Friday meetings at the kitchen table kept happening. The youngest woman at the table by 1994 was 22 years old. The oldest was Nora. Eleanor Whitfield lived to be 92. She died in her sleep in the spring of 2001. The notebook was open on her bedside table when Larry found her in the morning. The last entry was dated April 14th. It read, April rain sufficient. Pool full. Larry runs it well. Clarence learning fast. Elsbeth leads the women now. The land will stay. That was the last sentence she ever wrote. The funeral was in Calhoun. The Lutheran church was small. The Lutheran church was full. Vivian Purcell came in a wheelchair. She was 81. Darrell had died the year before, in his sleep, in the bedroom of the house he and Vivian had lived in for 53 years. Vivian came alone with her son driving her down from Topeka, and she sat in the front pew and she did not cry. And after the service, she rolled herself out to the lane and waited for her son to bring the car around. And Larry walked up to her and bent down, and she took his face in her two thin hands, and she said, Your mother saved my life. Twice. Once when my barn burned, once when I had cancer. There is nothing I can ever say that will be enough. He said, Mrs. Purcell. She said, Vivian. He said, Vivian. She knew. Elsbeth Hanley spoke at the service. Elsbeth Hanley was 51 years old by then. Elsbeth Hanley had been Nora Whitfield's student for 25 years. She stood at the front of the church and she did not weep, and she said, In June of 1976, I went to Eleanor Whitfield's farmhouse with a basket of bread and one question. I left 3 hours later with 73 years of weather in my head and a piece of paper in my hand, and the only true teacher I have ever had in this world. There are 19 women in this church today who can read a creek. There are 16 working storage ponds and dams in Calhoun County right now. There is a way of carrying knowledge in this county that did not exist before Eleanor Whitfield, and that will exist after all of us. She did that. She did it sitting at a kitchen table with a kerosene lamp on, with a leather notebook open between her and another woman. She did it the way her father had done it for her. She did it because she believed every day of her life that the land remembers what you give it, not what you keep. Elsbeth paused. She said, That is what she gave. The wind came down off the Flint Hills the afternoon of the funeral. It crossed the wheat. It crossed the creek. It crossed the limestone wall of the dam, which was standing, which is standing, which still stands, 2 years later. Spring of 2003. A young man came up the lane. He was 22 years old. He was driving a green pickup. He had on a clean shirt and a Stetson he was nervous about, because he had bought it the week before and had not yet broken it in. His name was Wyatt Purcell. He was Darrell Purcell's grandson. He ran the Purcell place now. He had inherited it in 2000 when Darrell died, and he had spent the 3 years since trying to keep it standing. In the spring of 2003, the rain stopped on the 5th of May. By July, Wyatt Purcell's corn was burning. He drove up the Whitfield Lane on a Wednesday morning. He came up to the fence at the edge of the bottom field. Lawrence Whitfield, 55 years old, was standing on the crest of the dam with his son Clarence, 24, beside him. They saw the truck. Larry walked down. Clarence walked beside him. Wyatt Purcell stood at the fence with his hat in his hands. He said, Mr. Whitfield? Larry said, Mr. Purcell. Wyatt said, I have 20 acres of corn that might still make something, if it gets water in the next 2 weeks. Larry looked at the pool. The pool was at 6 feet 8 inches. He looked at his son. His son nodded once. Larry looked back at Wyatt Purcell, the grandson of the man who had laughed at his mother in April of 1976. The grandson of the man who had pinned the cartoon to the co-op wall. The grandson of the man who, in October of 1982, had walked to his mother's door with his hat in his hands and said, I am ashamed. Larry said, I can give you enough for 15. Wyatt said, Mr. Whitfield, I will pay. Larry said, no charge. Wyatt looked at him. Wyatt looked at him for 3 seconds. Wyatt said, "Sir, Larry said, "My boy here will run the ditch to your fence line by Thursday. Tell your mother to come for coffee. Saturday mornings. The pot is always on by 9. Wyatt's hat was shaking slightly in his hands. He said, "Yes, sir." He turned. He climbed back in his green pickup. He drove home. Clarence stood at the fence next to his father. He was 24 years old. He was tall like his great-grandfather. He had the brown eyes of his great-uncle Howard, the one who died on a tractor in 1943. He said, "Dad?" Larry said, "What?" Clarence said, "She wrote about this, didn't she? The cycle, the grandsons." Larry said, "She did." Clarence said, "Which notebook?" Larry said, 1984, page 71. She wrote, "The work is not finished until the children of the men who laughed are the children who come to the fence." Clarence was quiet. Then he said, "Dad, I want to read for them. Friday nights. To the women." Larry said, "She would have liked that." They walked back up the rise together. That evening, in the kitchen of the white farmhouse on the south end of 420 acres of Kansas wheat and corn, Lawrence Whitfield sat at the kitchen table and opened the leather notebook his mother had used for the last 6 years of her life. He turned to the first page. In her handwriting, in pencil, dated April 1st, 1995, she had written, as a heading, "For whoever comes next, for the boy, for his children, for anyone who reads this when I am gone. My father said, 'Watch the land before you work it.' My mother taught me to keep house, which is a different kind of watching, and just as important. I would add this. Listen to the people who tell you you are wrong. They are telling you who they are, not who you are. Your job is to keep measuring. Your job is not to win the argument. Your job is to be ready on the day the world changes, with enough water for your own ground and enough left over for the neighbor at your fence. Build the wall. Stack the stones. Pack the clay. Teach the girl who comes to your door with a basket of bread, because someday she will be the one teaching the next girl. And that is the only way knowledge has ever moved in this county or any other. Some knowledge does not get louder when the world doubts it. It just waits." Eleanor Briarwood Whitfield, April 1st, 1995. The pool is full. The rain has started. The creek is up to the second mark. We will be all right. Lawrence Whitfield closed the notebook. He set it on the table beside his coffee. Outside, the wind came down off the Flint Hills the way it had come down for 10,000 years before anyone arrived with a plow. It crossed the wheat. It crossed the creek. It crossed the limestone wall his mother had set with her own hands in the summer of 1976, when she was 67 years old and a widow, and laughed at by 4 men on a fence line who did not yet know what she had seen. The wall held. The water held. The land remembered. And somewhere in the kitchen of a young farmer named Wyatt Purcell, 3 miles east across the section line, a young wife was setting a basket of fresh bread on the table. And she was saying to her husband in a quiet voice, "There is a woman who teaches the others. Her name is Elspeth Hanley. She sits at the Whitfield kitchen table on Friday nights. She is 73. I would like to go." And her husband, who was 22 years old and tired and quiet, said, "Go." And she went. And the work continued. And the rain came when it came. And the people who built were ready. And the people who had not yet built came, one at a time, to the fence at the edge of the bottom field, with their hats in their hands. And they were given water, and they were given drawings, and they were given a chair at the kitchen table, and they were told what every woman in Calhoun County by then already knew, that the land remembers what you give it, not what you keep, that some knowledge waits, and that the woman who built the wall had been right the whole time.